What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian. And we are joined by a very special guest, one in a now increasing line of people who are way too famous to be on this podcast. It's Glenn Greenwald. Welcome, Glenn.
Hey, I'm so glad you guys invited me on. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun explaining to my assistant, who's Brazilian and straight. I kept making him say the name of your show over and over because it was just making me laugh so much. And then I finally asked him if he understood what it meant, and he said he didn't. And then he did a little research, and he came back and he tried explaining to me what a twink was. So I had a huge amount of fun even before the show began.
I'm glad we can help. Obviously Glenn is the co-founding editor and a columnist at The Intercept. Probably one of our favorite journalists working today, and we're definitely excited to talk about some of that. But the way we came to meet was through our contributing editor River Page wrote an article about a sort of woke resurrection of a gay sex panic. I think it's the name of the article, in which he recounts some of the treatment you received at the hands of some online enemies and rivals and whoever else who like to recount the story of you meeting your then 19-year-old husband. You were 37, right, in Brazil. You're now many years later, married, have children, dogs. So guess what we're going to ask you is, what's it like to have your haters just remind you that your life is like a dream and amazing?
It's funny. There were colleagues of mine and friends of mine who were so indignant on my behalf over what was being said. And truth be told, it was pretty disgusting, not only because it was exploiting a lot of classic toxic tropes about gay men who, that were predators and pedophiles, and we recruit young boys into our lifestyle. It was playing on all those kinds of things. But it was also incredibly homophobic and racist toward my husband, who, has been in the public eye for a good amount of time now. In 2013, when I was doing the Snowden reporting, he was famously or infamously detained at Heathrow Airport, and because he was working on the journalism with us and carrying classified documents. And I remember very well, as this when that happened, there was this theme that instantly emerged that he was essentially a mule. That's what he was called repeatedly on CNN by people like Jeffrey Toobin, using this kind of like racist language about what people in South America are, that they're kind of stupid. They don't know what they're doing. They're easily used. And of course, he was incredibly integrated into the reporting the whole time. So that theme was already out there, and I spent a lot of time being accused by liberals and others of having manipulated him, of having exploited him, of having used my own husband as a mule, when he was the one who was like, no one else is carrying this fucking material but me. That's how he talks and that's how he thinks. And, so it was back then, we were already noticing there was a kind of a profile on BuzzFeed, the title of which was David Miranda's Nobody's Errands Boy. Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, had sent down a reporter, Natasha Vargas Cooper, to spend a week with me and David to sort of find out who is David Miranda, this person behind this, worldwide story. And she walked away with a really good sense of David, saying, like, anyone who thinks that he's some kind of a dupe is an idiot. This is like one of the most charismatic, aggressive, assertive people I've ever met in my life. And so then, now he's a congressman. He's a politician. He's 35 years old. He was elected to the Rio de Janeiro City Council in 2016 and then the federal Congress in 2018. So to hear him being talked about like he has no agency, he's just like some stupid brown whore who has been in a 15-year marriage with me, presumably because of money, which is kind of funny. So yeah, I think there was a little glitch, but as I was saying, he makes a very good salary now. When I met him, I actually wasn't, because I had moved to Brazil. I had been working as a lawyer in New York, but couldn't work as a lawyer in Brazil, and just started blogging. And so, the theme that is used to talk about him, even now as a 35-year elected congressman, continues to be this one that is very kind of unwittingly racist and xenophobic and homophobic. The idea that gay men in the global South are basically just toys for sex tourists and who are guided not by love and have no agency, but simply by money. It's a very kind of homophobic theme. And then there's like the flavored with racism and xenophobia. And it's incredibly ugly. And it's something we've experienced for a long time. When you're married for 15 years, the extent to which it bothers you when people talk about your marriage is kind of limited because, we have a very stable marriage. We have 2 children, careers that we've helped each other build. But I think it's reflective of this broader discourse in not just liberal circles, but unfortunately left-wing circles, this kind of increasing fixation on people's sex lives and private lives in lieu of doing much harder but more important politics.
Yeah, so clearly, yeah, both of you are very accomplished in your own right. Could you say a little more about the kind of the ugliness of some of the homophobic tropes you were wheeling out? Because I feel like maybe they've lost a little bit of their sting, but I can't imagine it's very nice being on the receiving end of them.
So, as you mentioned, what brought us together was this article that was published on your site by a writer who compares that were being made on me and my marriage to attacks being made on Alex Morse, the young 31-year-old gay mayor of Holyoke, who's currently mounting a Democratic primary challenge against this 16-term corporatist Democratic incumbent in Massachusetts, Richie Neal, who's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and essentially some college Democrats who wanted jobs with Richie Neal or otherwise just to kind of ingratiate themselves with him, cooked up this scheme to leak that Alex Morse was a predator and essentially a pedophile because he was, according to them, seeking out sexual relations with young college students, by which they mean, and everyone agrees, what are adults, 18 and older, purely consensual. But embedded in this discourse was the idea that there's something inherently immoral about an older gay man seeking out sex with someone who is younger than he, even if that person is fully consenting and is an adult. And that was very much the similar kind of morality that they attempted to apply to my marriage, that there was something wrong with my marriage because David, when we met, as you said, was he was 19, he was about to be 20, he was like 6 weeks away from being 20. I was 37. So it's this attempt to kind of, regulate people's sex lives. But in the case of Alex, I did identify it because it's been done to me by a lot of the same people from the same political, milieu. But in his case, I thought it was kind of worse because, as I said, we're very our marriage. Our marriage is something we regard as beautiful. We're proud of it. We talk openly about it all the time. Whereas with Alex, they were really dragging his activity and his Tinder hookups and the details of his personal sex life, dragging that into the public light in order to degrade and malign it in a really ugly way. So while I did identify with it in part, I feel like he was kind of in a more vulnerable position.
Yeah, and it seems like the same group is now trying to hold people responsible who actually are minors for like their past crimes, which they're trying to claim young people don't have agency with the Aaron Coleman case, which you've been quite vocal about. What is your thoughts on that? It seems like it's the same crew that kind of keeps going after you and Alex and now Aaron, who won his campaign like by 14 votes, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, there's a huge irony. So just, for anyone who doesn't know about that controversy, Aaron Coleman is this kid. He's 19. He is a classic kid from like a working class or even really impoverished background. He works as a dishwasher. He dropped out of high school, went back to a community college, got his GED, comes from like a very troubled background. His father is severely disabled with mental health problems. His mother was often unemployed as a teacher. His brother killed himself last year because of depression. It's the kind of, very common American life story, but someone that we almost never see in elected office. He mounted this primary campaign against a very similar incumbent to the one that Alex Morse is challenging, although it's on the state level in the Kansas state legislature. This 7-term incumbent whose name is Stan Fraunfelter. It's like the perfect political villain name. I mean, obviously anyone named Stan Fraunfelter is going to be horrible. And, he's a kind of Democrat who, even though it's a very liberal district, working class, poor liberals, because it's in Kansas City, has like always joined with the GOP to support criminalization of abortion, serves corporate interests, spends all his time with corporate lobbyists, and none of his time with people in the community. So Aaron won. And when he won, they kind of started suddenly discovering that in middle school, he had bullied 2 girls, one severely to the point where she said she contemplated or attempted suicide. And he also had obtained a nude photograph of one of his classmates from the internet and threatened to publish it if she didn't provide him more. And when she didn't, he published it. So really terrible acts, but one's undertaken when he was like 12 and 13. And my argument was, essentially twofold. One is that we shouldn't be judging adults based on things they do when they're children, which is for sure what someone is when they're 12 and 13. But the other was, in politics, we need to stop being obsessed with people's personal lives and the harm that they cause there, and think about the harm that people are causing with their use of the public power. And the irony of this, there was a huge irony involved in it. I mean, some of the attacks on me for I wasn't really defending Aaron Coleman. I was defending the principle that it's wrong and kind of creepy to use acts undertaken as a child to judge an adult. But the people who were attacking me, it was so ironic because a lot of them were the same people attacking me for defending Alex Morse. And what they were essentially saying was, in the Alex Morse case, they were saying, if you're 20 and 21, you're basically like a kid. You're too young to consent to sex. Even if you say that you want to sleep with a 30-year-old, you're just too fragile. You're basically like a child. But then in the Aaron Coleman case, they were saying, if you're 12 and 13, whatever it is that you do should stick with you well into adulthood and should inform who it is that you are once you're an adult. It was so incredibly contradictory. And yet, as I said, I think the common strain again is we're living in a society where we're under the thumb of imperialism, corporatism, Silicon Valley monopolies. In the pandemic, the richest billionaires have tripled and quadrupled their personal wealth, while everybody else, people being laid off by the tens of millions. It's a lot harder to do anything about those things, to challenge Amazon or the CIA or Wall Street. It's really easy to police people's personal lives and issue moral condemnations of what they're doing sexually or what they did as a kid and destroy them, especially in left-wing spaces. So there's a lot of focus on that because it's easy to do in lieu of actually doing hard politics.
Yeah, I mean, it is obviously worth drawing a nice bright line distinction between you or Alex Morse and Aaron Coleman in terms of nobody has ever alleged any wrongdoing on your part or Alex Morse's. Whereas Aaron Coleman, yeah, it's clearly monstrous, horrible thing to have done to somebody, but we're talking more about the culpability of children. However, we do have a bone to pick because we know you've done some grooming in your life. But of the dog variety. Sorry, I know everyone always asks, but we do have to ask about the dogs. This is still a gay podcast. How many dogs do you have, Glenn?
It's a good question. It's flexible because a lot of times we have 2 or 3 dogs at our house that we don't really count as our dogs. We can deem them foster dogs just to keep the count lower, even though we know internally that they're already our dogs and we're never going to give them away. So I think we have 2 of those currently designated as foster dogs and then 24 that we admit are our dogs. So we have a total of 26 dogs at our house. And then finally, David threatened to divorce me if I pick up one more dog. So I had to open a shelter that is run by homeless people. So it's kind of a dual purpose nonprofit. It helps homeless people by employing them and having social workers work with them to manage income and open banks. But at the same time, their work is that they take care of abandoned animals. They're typically homeless people who are living on the street with their pets anyway, so it's their labor of love. And then we have about 130 more dogs at the shelter, all of whom probably would be living in my home if David hadn't forced me to open the shelter. So the answer is 26 at home and about another 130 or so at the shelter.
Well, I don't know where you find the time, especially given, I mean, I think one of the really interesting threads to pull on here is, you are kind of a lone voice in terms of even talking about some of the gritty details of, this Aaron Coleman case or something, kind of confronting it head on. We wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of the state of journalism as you see it. I mean, you are one of the few people still doing what you might kind of call traditional investigative journalism in a high profile way, breaking open cases that nobody else has heard about before. Obviously, you work with Edward Snowden, those releases. What are your sort of thoughts on the current state of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think journalism, like a lot of sectors of American life, is in crisis. And I think it's true principally for two reasons. One is, for me, one of the most crucial functions of journalism, of a free press, is to be able to challenge pieties and orthodoxies and challenge the pronouncements of the most powerful factions, subject them to skepticism, to investigative scrutiny, to be willing to be brave and challenging popular opinion. That's the role of a journalist, right? If a journalist is just amplifying orthodoxies that emanate from the most powerful factions, they're really not performing much of a function and might in fact even be engaging in great damage. So to me, journalism needs the space to dissent, to question, to take unpopular views, to kind of cut against the grain. And one of the problems that's happening is with the advent of online media, the traditional model for how newspapers and magazines support themselves through ads and subscriptions has been destroyed, and nothing has ever really replaced it. And so what you see across the industry is huge numbers of jobs just disappearing. And obviously, everything has been made worse by the coronavirus pandemic, including the failing state of journalism. But it was already pretty terrible to begin with, even prior to 2020. And so if you're a journalist and you see 20% of your newsroom getting laid off, and you're so expendable, the last thing that you want to do is stick your head up and take an unpopular opinion, one that, challenges prevailing sentiment in elite liberal circles that might generate hostility toward you, because you see how easy it is to just get rid of you and how difficult it is to get a job because newsrooms are collapsing. So I think that's producing a fear-based conformity where very few journalists have the luxury, because of their stature or their platform, to do what journalism is supposed to do, which is to poke at things and prod and sometimes provoke anger and sometimes be adversarial. It's really breeding a conformity that I think is very unhealthy. And then the other aspect of it is so much of this plays out now on social media, particularly on Twitter, which to me is proof that Satan exists. Twitter is. You couldn't invent a device, a mechanism of a framework to foster the worst parts of humanity if you tried, than Twitter succeeds in doing. And one of the worst things it does, because of the emphasis on follower counts and likes and retweets and clout and attention and all of that. And then you have the kind of punishment, ratios and canceling and unfollowing, is it breeds its own conformity. You need to constantly validate and feed the people who are your tribe, your constituents, the people who are responsible for your platform being thriving. And that too creates these terrible echo chambers where, everybody's afraid to strike a single off-key note. And I think the combination of those two factors are shaping journalism in a way that I think is putting it into a crisis in terms of the function that it's supposed to perform.
So a really early attack of the Trump campaign was his criticism of the media, of the whole fake news narrative, and that was mostly from liberals. But now it seems like all the liberals are also going after the few remaining journalists like yourself or Lee Thane or like even Michael Tracy. Like, how do you deal with now a bipartisan like attack on the few remaining journalist institutions in the U.S.? Like, how do you maneuver through all of this?
It's interesting. I think, I've been doing this a while now. I started writing about politics in 2005 when I started my blog, and then I moved to Salon in 2007. I moved to The Guardian in 2012. I've done a lot of stories that have been very controversial, including the Snowden reporting in 2013 and a big expose that lasted all last year about the Bolsonaro government here in Brazil that created a huge amount of controversy and uproar in Brazil. So I've kind of developed a thick skin, to being attacked online. But, it's still, depending on the intensity and the magnitude of it, it's still can be difficult. But one of the things that I've realized over the years, and it's interesting because I talked to Alex Morse when the whole pseudo scandal, the fake scandal against him broke. And then I also talked to Aaron Coleman in the course of setting up the interview that I did with him. And what I told both of them was very similar, which was, when you're kind of the person at the heart of a scandal like this, or when you feel like you're being attacked from all different directions, the worst possible thing you can do is just stay online all the time, obsessed with every tweet that's about you, reading every Facebook comment. Because what's going to happen is it's going to create this impression that the world is focused on you more than they actually are. So you're going to feel completely besieged. And even worse, at some point, you're going to start to internalize the anger and the hatred that gets directed at you. Imagine I remember what was being said about me for the first week when I was defending Alex Morse, that I was a predator, that I was making apologies for pedophilia. Imagine what was being said to him. You guys probably saw some of it. Some of it was in that article, essentially saying you're a creep, you're scum, drop out. So imagine being the person just reading that about themselves out of nowhere. 1 minute you're in the mayor, you're running this kind of low profile local race, and the next minute the entire country seemingly is condemning you as this sex pest. The advice I gave them is just stay off Twitter and Facebook and mostly realize, and I think it's a really important point, that there are these undercurrents psychologically in the United States now where you look at every metric of mental health and it's worsening severely. Suicide and addiction and depression and anxiety disorders are all rapidly increasing. People have no job prospects or economic security. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic has isolated people even further from whatever community or friendship that they had. The economic crisis of 2008 already unraveled things, and now it's unraveling even further. So there's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration internally, and people use the internet and use social media to expel it. They can't tell it to their boss. They can't in real life tell it to people's faces. So they'll use whoever the villain is of the day that pops up on the screen to express their own hatred and anger and resentment that they direct at that person. So what I told Alex especially was, and something I've learned is, look, when people are online saying that, you're human garbage and you're human trash and you're, whatever they're claiming that you are, in almost every case, it's not actually about you. It's about them, and you can't take it personally. And so I think that that's one of the things that, you have to realize if you're going to be somebody who wants to do journalism, if you want to write, if you want to do activism, if you want to provoke people in terms of their anger or challenge their beliefs, you're going to make people angry at you. And you have to accept, number one, that oftentimes it's not directed at you, but number two, that's just part of the game. If you want a public platform and you guys are socialists, you self-identified as socialists, with a lot of heterodox views for people who are in the LGBT community of your age, you're going to make people angry. And the only way to avoid that is by either not doing it, just withdrawing completely, or just kind of assimilating, being Pete and Chase and Buttigieg. Those are the options. So, if you're not going to do that, you just have to kind of accept that that's part of the framework that you've chosen.
So I mean, obviously, we get some hatred online, but I mean, you are in Brazil much of the time and openly gay. I think from our perspective over here, comfortably in San Francisco, we've heard that things have been changing for LGBT people, specifically in Brazil under Bolsonaro. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of what you're seeing from there and what sort of cultural shifts are going on?
Yeah, the situation for LGBTs in Brazil is radically different than it is for LGBTs in the West generally, in the US specifically. And it's sometimes hard to convey because the progress in the US and in Western Europe has been so rapid that people of your age have kind of been born into a world in which a lot of the kind of animus, pervasive animus, is unknown. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, and of course there's like lots of residual barriers, but there's no comparison between what LGBT life was like in the 50s to the 80s and 90s to now. Whereas Brazil, culturally, because it is still a developing country, people call it the third world, is always behind at least a decade, if not more, culturally from where the U.S. and Western Europe are. So that's certainly true of LGBT equality. But the bigger problem is that the Bolsonaro movement that took over Brazil in 2018, for reasons that were very similar to why Donald Trump won or Brexit won, that people were just suffering and turned to a demagogue, is a movement that is very steeped in religious fanaticism and anti-gay animus. One of Bolsonaro's main planks when he ran for president in 2018 was one that, was easily recognizable as dangerous. He claimed that the left, generally, and gay men in particular, were trying to indoctrinate students as young as 5 to become gay with something that he made up and is called the gay kit. It's like a thing that, like, in the dirtiest, most depraved sewer of his brain, he concocted and claimed that there's this thing called a gay kit that was designed to recruit children into the gay lifestyle, kind of like the language of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson back in the 80s when the moral majority was reigning supreme. It's a very dangerous slander, because obviously parents have an instinctive compulsion to protect their children from things that they think are dangerous, and he purposely played with that. And at the same time, you have this emerging evangelical movement in Brazil that is growing rapidly. It used to be a very Catholic country. In fact, it was the largest Catholic country in the world. Now about 20% evangelical, and it's fervent kind of evangelical movement, and it kind of got into the Bolsonaro movement. So especially if you're a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, or an 18-year-old gay kid out of the big cities of Brazil, which is São Paulo and Rio, but even if you live there and you're poor, it's extremely common to hear of kids now who are LGBT getting kicked out of their house by their religious parents or by their following parents. Violence against gay couples is the roof. It's a very deliberately cultivated theme that has served this movement very well and has made life for LGBTs, particularly poor ones, and ones who live on the periphery of society, much more dangerous.
The notion of a gay kit sounds monstrous, but actually, if you go on the Twink Revolution merchandise store, you can buy one today. So. Yeah.
Yeah, the irony is that, of course, in Brazil it doesn't exist, but you guys probably do sell one.
Yeah, so we're going to start at least. We'll get one up here now.
Yeah.
So I think another issue that has been going on with Brazil is, like, you exposed basically the corruption with the Intercept, the Operation Car Wash in 2019, and you've been quite vocal about the changes in Brazilian politics since the regime change of Dilma Rousseff. I'm probably messing it up, and then later the imprisonment of Lula. And And I'm a libertarian. That's how I learned about you actually back in the day. I'm no longer a libertarian. I'm a leftist now. But it seems like once you started disagreeing on the Brazilian politics, you became an enemy to the libertarian movement, which is actually quite prolific in Brazil. Do you feel like that there's an inconsistency there and people don't want to actually address the truth? Or what do you think was going on with like this shift?
Yeah, it's interesting that first of all, it is interesting because the work I've done in the US politically has always I've always had a kind of affinity for libertarians, at least in some form or another, like to the extent that political labels get applied to me, it's often left libertarian. As a lawyer, before I started writing about politics, I defended a lot of free speech cases that were very controversial, and always politically kind of identified with the ACLU traditional type of civil liberties that everybody deserves free speech, against censorship of all kinds. And then there's other causes too, like drug legalization, which I support, that libertarians very much believe in. And when I first started writing, it was to protest the executive power abuses of the Bush and Cheney administration in the war on terror, which libertarian outlets like the Cato Institute were very much on board with that critique. And I spoke there several times and developed a relationship with them. So there's a lot of commonality between a lot of views on the left and libertarians, and especially, protesting things like mass surveillance and eavesdropping and defending the right of privacy, as I did during the Snowden reporting, is something libertarians in the US are very much on board with as well. You see, for example, there was a last week or so, Trump out of nowhere raised the prospect of a potential pardon for Edward Snowden. And one of the very few prominent politicians to say that Snowden should be pardoned was Rand Paul, because his libertarian background kind of leads him to that view that privacy is important and has been encroached on by the mass surveillance system that we exposed. Whereas in Brazil, it's completely different. It's a very new movement. It's a youth movement, which is really bizarre. It's creepy enough to call yourself a libertarian, but then to be like 20 and call yourself a libertarian is just like very strange. To have that be like, I'm not saying to like say, oh, I like have some libertarian views, but to just be like, my political identity is libertarian. And they really identify as, economic libertarian. So they're super into the absolutist theories of the free market, that there should be no social programs. They obviously come from like middle class and above families, which is why they don't think that social programs have any value, because they never needed them and likely never will. It's a very kind of reflexively privileged and primitive philosophy, but there was a really concerted effort made to spread it in Brazil because this younger generation was so disillusioned by the failures of the political class. And so this libertarian movement kind of latched on to the Bolsonaro campaign. It was one of the very few smart things Bolsonaro ever did, which was in 2018, when he was looked at as this kind of like crazy fringe candidate threatening to the political establishment, he announced that his finance minister, if he won, would be this person named Paulo Guedes, who's like, every libertarian who thinks about Paulo Guedes instantly ejaculates. He's like from the University of Chicago. He's like a libertarian cartoon. He loves Pinochet. He wants to privatize everything. So it got the oligarchs and the kind of business sector on Bolsonaro's side. And whenever they would support Bolsonaro, they would always say, oh, we're not voting for Bolsonaro, we're voting for Paulo Guedes. So the coalition that Bolsonaro had was religious fanatics, economic libertarians, and supporters of the anti-corruption car wash probe that put Lula in prison. And the reason that they were, the Bolsonaristas love that car wash probe, is in part because all polls showed that Lula was going to win in 2018. And so by imprisoning him, those prosecutors removed the primary obstacle that Bolsonaro faced to ascending to the presidency, which was Lula. But then at the same time, the judge who was overseeing that corruption probe and became a national hero, Sergio Moro, when Bolsonaro won, he joined the Bolsonaro government. So he convicted Lula, helped Bolsonaro become president, and then as a quid pro quo, got appointed to become the justice minister of the country, the second most powerful position in the country after Bolsonaro. And our exposés, which started maybe 4 or 5 months after Bolsonaro was inaugurated, were about showing the corruption by Justice Minister Moro at the time that he was the judge, and the car wash investigation generally. And it ended up freeing Lula from prison because of the corruption we exposed, and really destabilized the Bolsonaro government in a way that made myself and my husband, who is a congressman, as I said, as part of the most left-wing socialist party in the Congress, kind of the primary targets of the Bolsonaro hate machine, because we're a gay married couple, because he's a leftist and a socialist, because I was doing these exposés. And so it really provoked a lot of hatred, a lot of, threats. Neither of us have left our house in over a year without armored vehicles and armed guards. So we've kind of lived under this, regime of threats of violence, of personal attacks, of fake news about our personal lives. They tried to indict me and imprison me, and they're still kind of trying, even though they failed at the first level as a result of the reporting I did to try and criminalize it. So yeah, there was a big backlash, which reflected the impact of the reporting.
So, I mean, yeah, you've obviously paid an enormous personal cost for your political speech. You kind of mentioned, your past involvement with things like free speech cases and an affinity with the ACLU. I was curious whether you've sort of seen a cultural shift where some of the sanctity that was maybe once upon a time homed as a sort of core value, that like unpopular speech must be defended, it now seems controversial in ways that it wasn't even a few years ago. Have you seen that as well?
Oh, for sure. And as a matter of fact, ironically, the source in Brazil who provided me the archive that enabled me to do the reporting that I just described contacted me in May of 2019. So a year and a couple months ago. And when he contacted me, I was actually working on this like 5,000 word article about the internal divisions inside the ACLU itself, where you have kind of the older, maybe Gen X and I guess you could call them older millennials, younger Gen X types who have worked at the ACLU for 15, 20 years, who got attracted by the traditional ACLU defense of civil liberties. We defend the NRA, we defend the Ku Klux Klan when their free speech rights are being threatened. And then under the Trump presidency, this huge amount of money, this was infused into the ACLU by Democrats who looked at the ACLU, didn't know its history, as this kind of anti-Trump organization. And the ACLU was suddenly drowning in money with an expectation by their donors that they would use it for partisan ends. And they hired all these people who are younger, who are kind of more classically steeped in younger millennial or even Gen Z politics, who don't believe in free speech. They, when the ACLU in 2018 defended the right of the neo-Nazis to march in Charlottesville when there was an attempt to deny them a permit, it created this huge uproar inside the ACLU because there were huge numbers of people who bizarrely went to work at the ACLU but don't believe in free speech. Like, why the fuck would you go to work for the ACLU if you don't believe in free speech? It would be like going to write for Twink Revolution and thinking gay marriage is immoral, right? Like, it would be a really stupid, weird thing to do. A lot of them went to the ACLU. They don't believe in free speech. And I think that's happening more broadly on the left, without question, the liberal left, that the idea seems to be that we can no longer afford free speech, that with white supremacy and fascism on the rise, a premise I dispute, but even if it weren't true, let's assume it's true, that the only way to kind of control that is by empowering corporations and empowering governments to repress speech, to kick racist and fascists and homophobes and transphobes off of Twitter and off of Facebook, to kind of deny them a platform. So yeah, I think there's definitely a huge generational shift in how free speech is considered, just like, as we were talking earlier, there seems to be a big generational shift as well that's rejecting what had been a consensus in the late 1990s with the Clinton scandals, that what adults do in their private lives is nobody else's business. There's now a attempt to unravel that consensus as well.
Well, and the terrifying part about all of this is anybody who considers themselves, part of the left or having any radical views whatsoever, seems to be doing a little bit of a victory lap around, as they win these sort of small victories over, getting somebody kicked off Twitter or something. But it just seems like it's immediately going to be turned around and weaponized against the left, as sort of abridgments of free speech always have, right?
Here's the thing that's just so baffling to me, like genuinely confounding. So there's a premise on the left, which I agree with, that large corporations like Facebook and Google and government agencies like the Justice Department, the CIA, and the FBI are authoritarian institutions, are no friend of the left, are no friend of the working class, are no friend of socialism. Obviously, why would they be? They're institutions that exist in the case of the government to destroy socialism and protect capitalism. And in the case of large corporations, they're legally required to make decisions to maximize profit. So there's a lot of animosity on the left toward big government agencies and law enforcement agencies and big corporations, tech corporations. But then at the same time, there's this idea that what we need to do is empower those same agencies inside the FBI, prosecutors, police departments to punish and monitor and weed out hate speech, and demand that these tech companies that never wanted to regulate speech, what they wanted from the beginning was kind of to be thought of as like AT&T, this content neutral service, right? Like nobody expects AT&T to monitor telephone calls or to deny service to like Alex Jones or Milo Yiannopoulos. Their argument is we don't get involved with regulating content. Anyone who wants to use our service to communicate is free to do so. That's what the tech companies wanted for themselves. They didn't want the responsibility to censor and regulate speech, but it was foisted on them by mostly liberals who said, look, Facebook, it's irresponsible of you to allow these messages to go uncensored. And Twitter, you need to start kicking people off who express views that we think are dangerous. Obviously, if you put the power of censorship in the hands of huge corporations and oligarchs and billionaires and government agencies, they're not going to exercise that censorship to protect the marginalized. They're going to exercise it to protect the powerful. That's what those institutions exist to do. And this fantasy world, like let's leave aside the ethical question of whether we should want anyone censored. I think it's unethical, even if it were strategically beneficial. Leave aside the ethical question. It's madness. Who do you think they're going to? Just today, there was an article in Electronic Infantada, a pro-Palestinian website, that right now, as COVID appears for the first time in Gaza, Facebook has censored the page of the Gazan Health Ministry. And you go all over the world, and whatever dissidents there are, people on the left, those are the people getting censored. They'll censor people on the right if they're the kind of clownish right, like Alex Jones, but they're not going to censor CIA operatives,
right,
or people who are defending oligarchy or imperialism. They're just going to censor the left. It's the most idiotic, self-destructive course of action I can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. seems to be entering a sort of like giant battleground. I mean, things just keep intensifying, especially with the most recent cop killing of a black man in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We're seeing people just like yell at people just trying to drink their coffee or have like brunch on the street because they're not walking with them. And it's like, I guess, where do you see this going? Where do you see the U.S. headed? Do you think it'll get better soon if people like Biden or someone won, or do you think it'll just like keep going downhill regardless of who wins?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of factors going on as to why there's kind of a tinderbox. The U.S. has become this tinderbox, like seemingly ready to explode at any moment, or even in the process of exploding. I mean, the sustained protest and riots are pretty strong evidence of some serious undercurrent of anger and dissatisfaction. So I do think that you put your finger on the key factor, which is the election of Biden. I remember very well when I first started writing about politics in 2005, there was a huge amount of political energy on the left that was driven based on anger over, the war on terror and massive income inequality that peaked with the Iraq War, and then, kind of the excesses of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and then the drowning of New Orleans, and then the financial crisis of 2008. And then once Obama won, it all disappeared. It was like he just completely diffused with a single victory all of that energy, and it's kind of like the left just went home. They're like, hey, we won. We have Obama. We can't criticize him. We can't protest against him, even though he hasn't actually fixed anything, even though the war on terror is continuing, even though home foreclosures are exploding, even though he helped Wall Street at the expense of everybody else. We're in power and we love him. He's, an inspiring figure. And so that's it. We're done. I think a lot of the anger right now, a lot of the kind of marching and protesting, which I really, on the one hand, like to see, is grounded. It's in some sense grounded in the frustration over having been cooped up in their homes for 4 months because of a pandemic, with, cut off from everything, and are looking for kind of a purpose, right? Like a reason why their life has value and meaning. And this is given it to them. It's like a new religion. But I really think that if you look at how the media has covered Trump for 4 years, just this maximalist alarmism that he's a fascist, he's a dictator, he's controlled by Putin, just bombarding people with this idea that Trump is the root of all evil, and that prior to Trump, the U.S. was this idyllic democracy where the rule of law reigned supreme and norms were honored, and even presidents that maybe we didn't disagree with, like George W. fucking Bush, were like decent, honorable, good men. This mythology that has been cultivated deliberately by media outlets that have profited off of it, and organizations, activist organizations that have profited too, have told people that the key to fixing all your problems lies with removing Donald Trump from power. So on the one hand, I think absolutely that if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win, there's going to be this sense like, we won. The crisis is over. We can all go home. We don't need to protest anymore. We don't need to be angry. We have our country back. Yeah. On the other hand, if Trump wins, I really wonder, I don't think liberals are emotionally equipped to spend 4 more years under Donald Trump. I think they've been driven so mad that I don't really know what the reaction would be if he were to win.
Yeah, I mean, you keep making the point of like this idea Trump is a fascist, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, you wouldn't have Antifa in your bio if you weren't a fascist country. But now you have people like Noam Chomsky saying Trump is more dangerous than Hitler, like on the most recent interview. Like, do you see any consequences in the future because of this rhetoric? Like, do you think it's desensitizing what actual fascism could actually mean to these people? Like, what do you think is going to happen because of this rhetoric just keep going on and on?
Don't make me criticize Noam Chomsky.
No, I'm not going to make you criticize Chomsky.
No, I'm just kidding.
Do it.
I know. No, so I'll actually, he's a good friend of mine, and I did criticize him slightly when he came out and originally said that it's everyone's obligation to vote for Biden. And then we kind of talked about it and sort of got resolution, but not really. But, in Chomsky's case, what he's actually saying is something much more rational, as you would expect, given that it's Chomsky, which is what he's saying is climate change is a problem unlike anything the world has faced previously, because it doesn't entail the potential for suffering and death on a massive scale. It entails the end of the species, the extinction of humanity. So that problem is unlike any other. And the fact that Trump is making it so much worse means that he's exacerbating what is by far the most serious danger humanity has ever faced. So Hitler killed 6 million Jews and 5 million more people. That's 11 million people, but we're talking about 8 billion people on the planet imperiled by. Now, I think this is all hyperbolic, but at least it's kind of grounded in like a cogent argument. But the other people who are saying this, well, like the idea of like Trump as a fascist dictator, right now you have two different crises that not even authoritarians, but any standard world leader would exploit in order to increase their power. You have on the one hand a coronavirus pandemic where the public health is obviously endangered. And then you have a mass protest movement where dozens of American cities are routinely seeing rioting and looting and all kinds of lawbreaking. You have these two dual crises that leaders typically, just ordinary leaders, typically invoke in order as a pretext to seize more power. Trump hasn't seized any power. In fact, like to the extent he's being criticized, it was during the pandemic. He was criticized for not using his power to commandeer industry, to force them to make respirators, to force them to make masks, to impose curfews. And same now with the protest. His party is criticizing him for not deploying troops into American cities. So he's just a lazy buffoon. He's a clown. He's not a fascist. He's certainly not a dictator. Like, as you said, if he's a dictator, why can people put Antifa in their bios? Why aren't journalists in prison? Why is there a fucking election? These are things that dictators don't do. And I think that, maybe in an ideal world, he would like to be a dictator. George Bush once said my life would be a lot easier if I were a dictator. Like, I guess all presidents kind of get frustrated and think like, hey, I wish I didn't have to convince Congress to do stuff I, want to do. Or I wish there wasn't a Supreme Court that could invalidate the decisions I make. And I wish there wasn't a media to constantly lie about what I was doing or criticize me or whatever. He maybe wants to be a dictator in some part of his brain, but he's completely incompetent to get anywhere near that. And he really hasn't even tried. He's dangerous rhetorically, but not in terms of like his governance.
So, you mentioned Bush, and so I guess my entry into sort of political awareness was very much through, Patriot Act, Iraq War, the Bush era. But I feel like for a lot of people who maybe a lot of our listeners who perhaps didn't, where Obama was maybe their entry into sort of political awareness, you've written a lot about the Bush era, since the Bush era. Do you mind sort of describing some of those comparisons of like, I know it seems like Bush was a much scarier figure. It was a much scarier political time to live through. And yet you sort of hear this hyperbole about Trump. What are your sort of thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a great point. As we kind of alluded to earlier, I only began writing about politics in 2005. Prior to that, I was a lawyer in New York, and I really had stopped paying attention to politics, domestic politics, because in the 90s, it was kind of low impact, kind of penny ante disputes. It was dominant. The Soviet Union had fallen, so there was no more Cold War. There were no more wars. We were told we were going to have this peace dividend. Clinton did some wars in like the Balkans, but by and large, there weren't these like major geoconflicts. There wasn't, some big, massive enemy that the U.S. faced. The U.S. was the sole superpower. And it was dominated by these like petty bullshit sex scandals. Like Monica Lewinsky dominated the entire second term of Clinton's presidency. Didn't interest me. I really didn't give a shit if he was like getting blowjobs from a intern. I didn't want, I wasn't the thing that I found. It wasn't like my calling. So I just kind of ignored politics. I tuned it out. And then when the 9/11 attack happened, I was living in Manhattan and worked there. And I was in my office on the morning that it took place. You just could feel the entire political climate change. People were terrified, and people forget. It was a terrifying event. I mean, to watch those two World Trade Center towers collapse with thousands of people inside and the plane flown into the Pentagon. And then it was followed up like a month later by the Anthrax attacks, which people forget, which were really frightening as well, because the claim was being made that, anthrax could be sent through the mail and you could open a letter and inhale a fatal substance and no one knew where it came from. And so it just felt like life was unraveling. And Bush and Cheney did what I just said dictators do, or even authoritarians that Trump hasn't done, which is they seized on that crisis to essentially, create a shield around themselves where they couldn't be questioned or challenged. And if you did, you were accused of being unpatriotic. Andrew Sullivan was a very influential writer at the time who was accusing anybody who questioned the Bush administration of being a fifth columnist, essentially like a traitor. That was very much the climate of the discourse. It was very repressive. When the Patriot Act was passed, when the authorization to use military force were passed, the Patriot Act had one person in the Senate vote no, which was Russ Feingold. The authorization to use military force to go to war in Afghanistan had one low member of Congress, Barbara Lee, vote against it. There was no dissent, very little dissent. So just on that basis alone, you see incredible dissent. I think U.S. democracy is more vibrant than ever under Trump than it has been for decades in terms of like the vibrancy of the institutions. But the policies, there's not, by far the worst political crime of my lifetime, and I'm excluding Vietnam because it kind of ended in the first couple of years of my life. Probably Vietnam, is as bad. But in my lifetime, the worst political crime by far was the invasion and destruction of a country of 26 million people called Iraq, based on completely false pretenses. And as part of that, hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million Iraqis were killed. Thousands of U.S. troops. It destabilized the entire region. As part of it, there was a worldwide torture regime implemented where torture was legalized. They had a rendition program, which is basically kidnapping, where the CIA would just kidnap people off the streets of Western Europe who they wanted but had no legal grounds to extradite, and send them to Syria or Egypt or other allies in the Middle East to be tortured and interrogated there. They set up a ocean prison called Guantanamo where people were put there and are still there 20 years later with no trial, no due process, no charges of any kind. And they even asserted and exercised the right to arrest American citizens without charges and declare them military enemy combatants. So there's no comparison in terms of the erosion of democracy or the moral evils that were undertaken by George Bush and Dick Cheney. There's nothing like it in the last 4 years under Trump that compared. The only thing that people cite to try and make the argument that maybe there's something comparable are the border policies of detaining and separating parents and children. And, the only thing I'd have to say about that is that Obama deported more people than Trump. And probably the most telling moment for me of the Trump era in terms of how the media thinks was when one of those douchebags at the Pod Save America show, I forget which one, all of whom work for Obama, went on Twitter and they got some picture of like kids in cages and they're like, this is sickening to see. This is not who we are. And it turned out to be a picture from 2014 when fucking Obama was the president. Oh. So, it's his attempt to say that like Trump is this singular evil when in reality, he's just continuing what the U.S. has always done. But you're right. There's just a lot of people started paying attention for the first time to politics because of fears of Trump or because just of age. They came of age, during the election in 2016. And they have no recollection of what George Bush and Dick Cheney, who they were, what they did, to the point where, like the communications director for Bush's reelection campaign in the Bush White House, Nicole Wallace, is a host on MSNBC, and she is beloved by liberals. George Bush hangs out with Ellen, and everyone thinks that's fine. Or he goes to the funeral of John McCain and passes a candy to Michelle Obama, and the entire internet melts as though it's the kind of like sweet decency that we always were governed by and no longer have. It's complete historical revisionism of the worst kind. And it's being done by propagandists to suggest that Trump is the singular evil.
Yes. Rather sickening to watch somebody, who just, you can see the blood on his hands, passing candies around and getting accolades for it. So Glenn, we want to, we're coming up on time. We have the benefit of reading you and your colleagues in The Intercept. Just wanted to kind of ask, like, what are you reading, and like what where are you what are you enjoying that you feel like is giving you a sort of a clear-eyed view of the world these days?
Well, so I think, I start my day usually reading like the mainstream journals, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the Washington Post, because I think it's important to have an understanding of what people in the halls of power are talking about, what they're thinking about, what's on their radar. And as propagandistic as those outlets are, they also do have investigations and facts that are kind of draped in propaganda that you could kind of extricate the facts from. And I think it's important to not ignore those journals. And then I kind of use social media to curate information. There's people on social media who, I try really hard to avoid ever creating an echo chamber of only paying attention to or following people who see the world the way that I see them. I try and find smart people who see the world differently than I do. And a lot of times they're not people with blue check marks next to their name or people who are known. They can even be anonymous. So that I'm just always making sure that any assumptions that I have or beliefs that I formed are being challenged and questioned. And I think it's very important as well not to get too immersed in politics, because if you're too immersed in politics, you can lose touch with your humanity. So I read a lot of spirituality. I read a lot of Buddhism. I read a lot of Indian mysticism. I just think it's important. I think one of the things that can happen is if you get too dogmatic and too ideological about politics, you lose touch with the humanistic aspect of politics. You stop actually caring about the thing that originally motivated you to pay attention, which is the desire to make the world a better place, to improve society, to improve people's lives, to defend people from injustice who are marginalized and needing of defense. I think it's very important to kind of remain eclectic and not let yourself get too immersed in any one way of thought.
Well, so everybody remember, go follow Glenn on Twitter, G Greenwald, and read The Intercept. And you can go read River Page's article that tells the sad story of people coming for Glenn and his husband and Alex Morse on Twink Revolution website. Glenn, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just echo that. I encourage people to go read that article. It kind of renewed my faith in young gay politics, which has become very assimilationist. So it was great to see that. And I really enjoyed the discussion we had. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. We're clear. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thanks a bunch.
All right, guys. Good talking to you. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.